Right. I'd like to formally welcome everybody to this week's live broadcast from Dharma Retreat Centre on a beautiful sunny spring morning on April the 15th. Yeah, probably April the 15th, hope so. First thing I want to say is I have confirmed that this really is a cherry tree outside. I'll just move out the way so you can see it better. I'm just going to raise my laptop screen so you get a better view. So there it is against the hills on the other side of the glen. And you can see it's slightly pinkish already against the blue-green of the conifers in the distance there. And I went over up close, and it looks like the cherry blossoms haven't actually emerged yet, but the leaves have emerged, and they're kind of in little pinkish clusters. So that's kind of in advance of the cherry blossoms actually arriving. So move that back in. It's a bit of a compromise with the technology because I'm just using a laptop to do this filming with a built-in laptop camera, so it's not a very high tech. So it's a bit of a compromise in terms of exposure and camera quality and being able to see me and being able to see the background at the same time, but best I can do for the time being. So I'm going to give a talk today, which you probably know in advance, is called Vision is Vital. And I'll not be leading a meditation, a formal meditation beforehand, but what I'll do is, as I did last week, I'm going to leave pauses every so often in the talk, because I really think that when you're actually attending, especially when you're attending to a Dharma talk, it's really important for your emotional side to really catch up and engage. And it takes a while for that to happen. So it's always a good idea in Dharma talks to not just talk non-stop, but to pause and just let it sink in. Just let it drop down to a deeper level, which is what I was doing last week. And there's no hurry. We're here for nearly an hour, and the birds outside aren't in any hurry, and I'm not in any hurry, and we can just take our time over this. It's not going to be a very intellectually demanding talk. I'm not really into that kind of thing. But I do want to explain what I mean when I say vision is vital. In the invitation that went out, there was some attempt at clarifying what I meant, but I've now got plenty of time to unpack what that means, those three words. And I'm going to take up where I left off last week. I gave this talk called There is Suffering, Yet Spring is Here. And some of you may have heard that talk. I've had quite a few messages to say how moving it was and how helpful people found it personally. So thank you for that. I always appreciate the messages and I value the feedback. So last week, there is suffering, yet spring is here. And in last week's talk, there is suffering, yet spring is here, I referred to what is traditionally the first discourse that the Buddha ever gave, which he gave, according to the tradition, just shortly after he'd left Bodh Gaya, after having attained enlightenment and become the Buddha. And I quoted a translation of the first discourse he gave to his first 5 disciples, and where he actually expounds the 4 noble truths. And I quoted what he said about the first truth, which is the truth of suffering, in detail, all the different kinds of suffering. And I quoted the Buddha saying, but what makes that suffering worse and aggravates it is when we cling to things in a certain way. To understand what he meant by that, we have to study and study the Dharma. It's not obvious on the surface. This whole concept of attachment being a bad thing. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on the circumstances. And but what he was getting at is that when you fixate on something and cling to it in quite a rigid way, and especially when you identify with it as me and mine and build a sense of self around it, then you're likely to make your suffering worse than it needs to be. That's what he was getting at. What he was teaching was that the reality of things is that everything arises and passes away, and there's a constant stream of change, of impermanence. And if we try and grab things and hold on to them and fix them, and insist that they stay and that you sort of own them, then you just make your suffering worse, really. That's what he was getting at. So there's something about craving for things to be fixed and craving for ownership and control, which just is out of touch with the way things really are, and it just creates more suffering. So this kind of craving is the second noble truth, and this is what the Buddha meant, that if you crave for things in that kind of a way, then you make your suffering worse. There's a certain amount of human suffering which is just part of having a human body that ages and gets sick sometimes with infections, as we all are very aware of just now, and eventually dies for all of us. And the inevitable sufferings of that for oneself and also for one's friends and loved ones when that happens to them. There's a lot of suffering involved in that, and that's not something that the Buddha could take away, but what he could do is help us not to make it worse by clinging to things in an unrealistic, unhelpful way. So that's what I was talking about last week. So the first truth is the truth of suffering, human suffering. The second truth is the truth of how craving and clinging can make that worse than it needs to be. And then the third truth is how actually it doesn't need to be like that. We can learn how to let go and open up to reality, which takes a lot of mind training and a whole system of practice. But the fourth truth says there is a system of practice available. And so the first two truths are about suffering and craving, but then the third and the fourth are about the end of suffering, the end of that clinging and clenching that aggravates suffering, at least. And it's about how there's a whole path of practice, a whole set of practices that enable us to do that, to make that radical transition, that shift of consciousness. So those are all of the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha gave. And so the third truth is liberation is possible. And the fourth truth is, when the Buddha described it back then, was expounding the path of practice as the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, the first limb of the Noble Eightfold Path, the very first step on that path is vision. And it's opening up to the Buddha's vision of reality and trying to see things the way the Buddha saw the world. Trying to see your life the way the Buddha saw your life, and trying to get a sense of what that might have been like by practicing. So you practice emotionally, you practice ethically in terms of your speech and your relationship with other people and the way you earn a living. You practice by working with your emotional states particularly, which is I think that's the sixth limb on the Noble Eightfold Path. And you practice meditation and mindfulness, which is the other two limbs. So all of these ways of practicing help us to get into the kind of mind state and attitude that something like the Buddha had, so that we can see things and experiencing something like he did. And that way we can gain insight into what he was talking about and have direct personal experience of the truth of what he was saying. So that's the whole path of practice according to the Eightfold Path, which is the fourth truth. And he just expounds that briefly in that first discourse. And as I said, the very first limb is vision, where you, having studied the Buddha's teaching and got a sense of the way he saw things, you see if you can look at things from that point of view. It's a bit like you're trying on the Buddha's spectacles and seeing what the world looks like. The Buddha is traditionally said to have given that discourse just shortly after he left Bodh Gaya. And he attained enlightenment at Bodh Gaya. And it was a huge sort of shaking experience for him. And it took 2 months for him to assimilate that. He stayed there and he meditated under a number of different trees there and had a number of other realizations in the course of that time. And towards the end of that series of realizations, he had a vision of humanity. And the way he envisioned humanity was that human beings are like lotus blossoms that start in the black mud at the bottom of the pool and then rise through the water, possibly dark, muddy water. And while they're rising, they're just all sort of clenched into a sort of lotus bud that is full of potential, but it's all hidden, it's all locked away inside. But then as they grow and develop spiritually, each human being, as it were, is like the lotus bud rising through the muddy water and then breaking surface into the sunlight and then beginning to open. So that clenched lotus bud opens into the sunlight. And what emerges, that's been hidden all this time, is a most beautiful blossom, a lotus blossom. And the fragrance issues forth, and there's this beautiful color. And as it opens into the sunlight and the space and the wind, it's just delightful. And the Buddha's vision of humanity is that everybody is like a lotus blossom, but some of them are still stuck down in the mud. And some of them are rising up through the muddy water, but they're still clenched up in that tightly closed bud. But some of them have broken surface and they're emerging into the light. I suppose that represents the light of awareness. And as they emerge into the light, their inner potential reveals itself, because that beautiful blossom has been hidden inside all this time, and now it actually starts to emerge. And what is represented by the full emergence from the bud of the lotus blossom is enlightenment itself. So that was the vision of humanity that the Buddha had at Bodh Gaya just before he left. And that, according to the tradition, is what inspired and motivated him to try, at least, to reach out and communicate Bodhi, communicate enlightenment, because until that point, according to tradition, he felt that it was so unlike anything in mundane experience that he didn't think that anybody could possibly understand. But that vision, according to tradition, is what motivated him to try. So he set out to find the first 5 disciples. And interestingly enough, he set out at the beginning of the rainy season, when the whole landscape in India was beginning to come to life, and the leaves were starting to unfurl and the blossoms were starting to emerge. So it's a little bit like our springtime, really. That's the time of year when the Buddha set out to teach his first discourse. So that was the Buddha's vision of humanity. It was a vision of tightly closed buds, but that have the potential for blossoming when they emerge out of the darkness into the light. And how beautiful they are. And how it's not just one blossom that emerges, but a whole array of lotus blossoms. Different colors, different shapes and sizes, every one of them unique. But what they all have in common is human potential, which is Buddha potential, that has now emerged. So that was the Buddha's vision, and it was a very inspiring vision for him, and it's what motivated him to start teaching the Dharma. And according to tradition, it's only because he saw that vision that he set out and tried. And of course, huge consequences came of that first teaching that he gave. He held the first ever Buddhist retreat, 2 months long. And those first 5 disciples, by the end of the retreat, they were all enlightened. And he sent them all off to teach and share what they discovered, not just keep it to themselves. And during his lifetime, he was repeatedly exhorting his disciples not to just enjoy the peace and bliss of the enlightenment experience, but to go out and share with the people. And there's a famous discourse later on when 64 enlightened ones go forth from this Buddhist retreat a few years later, and he says, "Go forth for the welfare and happiness of the many." And Bahujana Hitaya in Pali, the welfare of the many. So the Buddhist vision is not just a vision of what's possible for every human being, but it's also a vision of how, when that opens, then it should naturally open out and share itself with everyone. And in its fullness, the vision is a vision for all of humanity, without exception. And not only all of humanity, but all sentient beings whatsoever throughout the cosmos. No sentient being left out. That is the Buddhist vision. And that kind of vision was really elaborated upon and expressed very, very fully and beautifully by the Mahayana. This is a few centuries after the Buddha lived and died and gave his teachings. When the phase of Buddhist history known as the Mahayana came into its own in India, and they really emphasized this altruistic aspect of reaching out and sharing, and as you practice the Dharma and you start to discover what Dharma practice can do, you share it. And you share it with your friends and family, which is a natural thing to do, but you also share it with strangers, and you share it with anybody who is interested. You don't do it in a dominating way. You don't ram it down people's throats. But if people are interested, you share. So this Buddhist vision within the Mahayana phase was known as the Bodhisattva ideal. So it's an ideal of training so that the vision is not just attaining enlightenment for yourself, but to keep on training and practicing until all beings have gained enlightenment, which means that the path of practice is an indefinite path. It doesn't have an end point. It just goes on opening out more and more and more, further and further. And I've always found, ever since I discovered the Bodhisattva ideal, I've always found that a very, very inspiring vision, I must say. And the Bodhisattva path is a path of training. The Bodhisattva, 6 paramitars of the Bodhisattva, training in generosity and morality and patience and vigor and meditation and wisdom. And there's a famous Mahayana scripture by Shantideva called the Bodhisattva. And when he talks about training in the paramatara of patience, he says, "There is nothing whatsoever that is not made easier through acquaintance. So through becoming acquainted with small harms, I learn patiently to accept greater harms. Who has not seen this to be so with trifle sufferings, such as the bites of snakes and insects, feelings of hunger and thirst, and with such minor things as rashes? I shall not be impatient even with heat and cold and wind and rain, even with sickness, even with bondage and beatings. For if I am, the harm they cause me will increase." That's the words of an advanced practitioner, indeed. Somebody who can tolerate not just the bites of snakes and insects, and hunger and thirst, and rashes, and heat and cold, and wind and rain, but even sickness, and even imprisonment, and even beatings. And that's very advanced practice indeed, without becoming impatient. Now, what's meant by that is without falling into reactive anger, without hardening into a separate self that indignantly separates off from the outside world and then gets into some kind of polarized, angry conflict. So this is very advanced practice indeed. Most of us who have started to learn to meditate, we can put up with minor things like a minor itch while we're meditating, without it undermining our peace of mind and our contentment and tranquility. Most of us would find an extremely intense itch would completely derail our meditation, you know? So he talks about minor things such as rashes. So for example, chronic eczema. would for a lot of us make meditation pretty much impossible, intolerable, because we're just beginners in all this path of practice. But the path of the Bodhisattva path is where you start. You make it easy for yourself, and you're realistic about what you can handle, and you provide all the supportive conditions you need, and you just practice tolerance and patience, not to give way to impatience in the middle of your mindfulness of breathing or metta bhavana, and to say, the hell with it, I'm giving up. But to just have patience and see the meditation through. In other words, learning to work with your mind to stay in creative, open-hearted mind rather than reactive mind. So this is the elementary stages of the path. But then as you become better and better at mind training, you get more and more skilled, then you learn how to tolerate aggravation on a more advanced level and stay open-hearted and stay creative and stay at peace and stay empathic and with a sense of being part of everything, which is the whole, experience of Buddha mind. It's not easy to do that, but with patience with yourself especially, little by little, you can gradually train so that you can tolerate more and more difficulties until the verse that Shantideva is talking about, even sickness and bondage and beatings, actually is feasible. Now, extraordinary as it may seem, there have been some Mahayana practitioners that have attained that. The Buddha was one of them. Some of his disciples during his lifetimes, they were amongst them. And even in our own recent times, there have been some extraordinary people who've told their life stories. I'm thinking particularly of the advanced practitioners among Tibetan lamas when the Chinese invaded Tibet in the 40s and 50s. And recently I was rereading the life story of Palden Gyatso, his life story called Fire Under the Snow. I'll just hold it up so you can see it. So there it is. And that's his photograph on the back. He looks very gaunt. He had spent 33 years in various Chinese jails after his arrest by the Chinese after they invaded Tibet. Several times he nearly starved to death. Many times he was forced to sleep outside, which in Tibet is a life-threatening thing to happen. Fortunately, his health and resilience were strong enough to resist all of that. But the wonderful thing that emerges from this quite harrowing tale is that his mind was not broken by the experience. The integrity of his vision, his bodhisattva vision, and his commitment to the Dharma was not derailed by any of it. And the Chinese finally released him after 33 years, reviling him as a stubborn old ox that no amount of socialist reform could change. And, they kind of dismissed him with a kind of contemptuous attitude of, somebody as stubborn as you're just useless, and we may as well turn you out. That was their attitude. But actually, when I read his story as a Buddhist practitioner, I am deeply, deeply inspired by his example, because from my point of view, what emerged is that the Chinese warders and torturers and beaters were unable to break his spirit. And when he tells the story, he talks about, for example, 6 months where his hands are shackled behind his back and his feet are shackled together. so that he couldn't even feed himself or go to the loo by himself. His prisoners had to feed him by hand. And yet, even during that time, he would lie on his bed or sit on his bed, and he would recite the scriptures that he'd learned by heart when he was growing up as a young man in a Tibetan monastery. And he would recite the prayers that he had memorized. I guess he's talking about mantras to the various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And even though externally his physical conditions were very, very, very severe and demanded a tremendous level of patience, in order to even tolerate them and maintain his emotional equilibrium, let alone give way to anger. And yet he managed to sustain his bodhisattva vision by reciting to himself the mantras and the scriptures that he had memorized. And what those mantras and scriptures were doing is that they were sustaining his vision. He had something to live for. He had something to live up to. And even in his prison cell, he would have experienced a sense of solidarity with all other practitioners in the Sangha. A sense that he was not alone, that he was in the company of the enlightened ones. When someone has a vision like that and have a sense that they're determined to survive even the most terrible sufferings so that after they're released, they can continue to practice and continue to share the Dharma. When somebody has a vision like that, it's incredibly powerful in sustaining them and their stamina, their ability to put up with suffering. People, I mean, this goes back through human history. People have been capable of tolerating the most horrific sufferings when they have a sense of purpose and meaning that sustains and inspires them, something to live for. Another book I've been rereading recently is Viktor Frankl's book called Man's Search for Meaning, about 2 years incarcerated in Auschwitz concentration camp. And he too is the most extraordinary spiritual practitioner who I find deeply inspiring and moving, you know. And the story he tells is so harrowing that at times I found it hard to take. Like Viktor Frankl, like Palden Gyatso's book, there were 3 chapters in that book I just didn't have the courage to read them. I just found them so terrifying. I couldn't bring myself to read them. But I'm deeply inspired by individuals like that. And both men, when they were finally released, they went on to have a life after imprisonment. Viktor Frankl lived another 50 years, and he founded a whole new school of psychotherapy to bring succor and healing to the people who'd been traumatized by their experiences in the wartime. I guess particularly the Jews that have been traumatized by the Holocaust. He was, of course, a Jew himself. And what arose out of this form of psychotherapy is that when somebody has a vision of life that gives their sense of their meaning and purpose, then they tend to survive and they tend not to be broken. This is something he noticed in Auschwitz, amongst his fellow prisoners. And he founded a whole new school of therapy, logotherapy, on this basis, to help other people who become suicidally despairing at times. Just to get in touch with their true values and what really truly matters to them. Now that is the effect of coming on retreat, isn't it? Sometimes you come on retreat and you are despairing, maybe despairing of people, you know, human beings. You think people are just horrible. They deserve to be wiped out by climate change. You know, they're just, somebody told me one time when he was feeling particularly negative, they're just vermin. Yeah, that's right. Well, this isn't the way that the Buddha saw human beings. He saw something really beautiful locked up within every single one of them, and he had faith in humanity. And it was his vision of humanity, the lotus pool vision of humanity, that inspired him to teach the Dharma. And practices like the 5-stage metta bhavana take place within that vision. It's a vision that never gives up on anybody, nobody at all in the entire universe. And that's why in the 5th stage of the metta bhavana, you have a place in your heart for everyone. When one is inspired, one is able to go through sufferings, and one has an extraordinary resilience and ability to not just contract into ruthless selfishness and anxiety, but to stay open-hearted and courageous and peaceful and be there for others and help others, empathize with their troubles. Vision is vital. One of the things that emerged from the terrible crisis of the Chinese invasion of Tibet is the Tibetan diaspora. Thousands of Tibetan refugees managed to escape, including the Dalai Lama, and have now started to teach in the West. And, and in the East. They've started to teach all over the world. I mean, it's because of the Tibetan invasion that the Dalai Lama moved out of India, and then since then, with assistance, he had written dozens and dozens of books, and he's flown all over the world and give Dharma teachings, and his disciples and fellow practitioners have done the same. There's been this huge blossoming of Buddhism across the world thanks to the crisis brought about by the Tibetan invasion, the Chinese invasion of Tibet. So sometimes a terrible crisis, in the midst of that, if people can get in touch with what really matters in human life, and then through becoming re-inspired with their vision, they enter into creative mind and compassion. They can sometimes see new possibilities that arise out of that crisis that open out for many, many years to come. That's the effect of vision. I think of the vision that has sustained Sangharakshita, for example, when he came back from India as a Buddhist monk in the 1960s. He had virtually no money when he came back, if any at all, but he had a vision for wanting to spread the Dharma in the West. And as a Westerner himself, born in London, and having studied in the East under Indian and Tibetan teachers and a Chinese guru as well, he wanted to share what he discovered. He wanted to share his discovered because he was a practitioner of the Bodhisattva ideal. So he set about in a small way in a basement in London in 1967. And now, over half a century later, there are a network of teaching centers all over the world. And this is one of them, Dharmakosha, where I'm sitting here now. If it wasn't for Sangharakshita's vision back in the 60s, Dharmakosha wouldn't exist. I wouldn't be sitting here with a shrine room in the background. And this whole setup, you know, and me teaching you now, it would never have happened. It's only come about because of Sangharakshita's vision for what he wanted to achieve. So thanks to him, something new arose out of all that and spread across the world. So sometimes in the midst of crisis, something new can emerge, but only if you get in touch with your vision and your inspiration, and you drop out of reactive mind into creative mind and open your heart. It's crucial that we learn to do that. Train the mind. I keep on emphasizing this every week whenever I give this talk, because it's what Buddhist teachers always do. They always emphasize mind training as crucial. It goes back to the Buddha. He said it, and it's true. It's absolutely true. Everything flows from mind. If you can manage to work patiently and compassionately with your mind, sort of with a combination of you know, gentle, compassionate words, and providing yourself generously and compassionately with all the supportive conditions you need, being endlessly patient with yourself and all your reactions, you know. It takes a lot of compassion and a lot of patience. But if you can do this and you learn the skills of mind training, which is involved, you learn how to spend more and more of your time in creative mind. So you're not, for example, obsessively, compulsively following every single news broadcast about the latest in the coronavirus every few minutes. You're not constantly grabbing your phone and reading your latest messages, you know, because that's the reactive mind, and it's a waste. It's a waste of human potential to be locked up in that very superficial, very kind of cyclic, reactive kind of level of thinking. Lots of rapid fire, complex bits of information zipping around your mind. If you can train yourself to drop down into a much more peaceful and contemplative mind state, where you can sort of step back from what's going on and say, okay, there's this crisis, this is the phase of human history we're up to now. How can I contribute to turning this into something positive? I was reading a historical novel last week, and that was very helpful. Just reading about what was happening 1,000 years ago gave me a sense of perspective that helped me to sort of hold this present time of the corona epidemic in context. And likewise, I've been thinking about, well, what will life be like in a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Now that we're gaining all these skills of video conferencing and all these other things that we're learning through this crisis. Sometimes in the midst of a crisis, some completely new ideas emerge, and people learn new skills, and some of them make very significant progress in their spiritual lives, for example, through renunciation, as like a sort of enforced simplification of their lifestyle, maybe simply because they've got more time, and then they choose to spend it in meditation and mind training, and it changes their whole life. You know, I'm sure that there will be thousands of people in the world who will spiritually benefit from the challenges of this experience if they can embrace the challenges in a positive way. Just think what emerged after the Second World War, for example. The United Nations was founded in 1945. Where would we be without the United Nations and all of the little departments of the United Nations, such as the World Health Organization? You know, the one that's trying to coordinate people's efforts to combat COVID-19? it's a United Nations department, and it was founded in 1948, a few years after the war ended. Another institution that was founded after the war was the National Health Service, founded in 1948. So all of the suffering of the Second World War, for example, when people were fighting for their country and fighting for their values, when they came home, they wanted people to be they wanted their own people to be really, really well looked after. And a Labour government was voted in 1945 that basically passed a few pieces of legislation that founded the National Health Service. And where would we be without the National Health Service in the UK? We're very lucky in the UK because a lot of people worked very hard through times of great suffering and deprivation for themselves to bring this about. A lot of hard work has gone on amongst our ancestors to provide the kind of world that we're living in the UK just now. And a lot of that has come out of times of suffering where people had a vision. They had a vision of what could be achieved. And that vision included free healthcare for all and many other things. And they worked and worked and worked through great privations and sufferings and disappointments because they had a vision. The vision sustained them. And as a result, we have the life that we're living, and then the NHS has come into existence. Vision is vital. Crucial. About 8 years ago, in 2012, there was a book published called Active Hope by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston. And I'll show you Active Hope. So there it is. So it's subtitled How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. Beautiful cover, isn't it? By Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston. I recommend this book. It's co-written by somebody who is spent a lot of years in her youth training in Buddhism and studying Buddhism, Joanna Macy, American. And then in the 1970s, she was very concerned about what was going on in the environment and what was going on in terms of the nuclear arms race as well. And she set about developing group work, training workshops, therapeutic workshops, where people who were so stunned by the dangers in the world that they couldn't manage to face it all. They just weren't strong enough to face it. They were just sunk in horror and despair. So they just had to turn away and look the other way while it was all going on. And as a result of this, thousands, millions of people who might otherwise be doing something constructive in response to these dangers were, the word she used was disempowered. They were disempowered. And her first book, I think, on this subject was called Despair and Personal Power in the Nuclear Age. I met Joanna Macy shortly after she launched that book. She was over in London launching the book, and I met her. And I read the book, and it had a significant effect on me back then when I read it back in the 80s. She knew that people were disempowered by what in the Buddhist tradition we call the reactive mind, disempowered by their fear, disempowered by their despair. And because they'd been disempowered, they weren't able to positively contribute to a better world. They just had to turn away from facing up to the horrible things threatening the survival of humankind. And millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, were disempowered by their own reactive emotions, really. So she managed to develop this group therapy work, which she called the spiral of the work that reconnects, to reconnect people with their heart and with their human potential for courage and compassion and wisdom. And so she's been running these workshops for ever since, well, let's see, 40 years. She's still running them. She's I think in her 90th year now. There's a whole new generation of people running them now, I'm very happy to say. And Chris Johnston is one of those, her co-author, and he's also a psychologist. He's a psychiatrist, in fact, a qualified doctor. And he's specialized in positive psychology, the psychology of what the research tells us about how to stay in a positive, creative state of mind, even under duress. There's plenty of research evidence into that. He studied it, and he brings that into the book as well. And he hasn't been trained as a Buddhist. He doesn't call himself a Buddhist, but he's got a wealth of experience from the secular scientific world, and which has a lot to contribute to this. Now, the title of the book, Active Hope, is all about vision. And the way it works is this. Passive hope is, well, let's hope somebody sorts it all out. I'm sure somebody will develop something, maybe some new bit of technology that will solve all these problems. I can't be doing with it just now. I'm too busy, and anyway, it's too horrible. I'll just hope for the best. I'm not talking about that kind of hope. That's passive hope. The kind of hope I'm talking about is envisioning the kind of world that you would like to arise out of the mess we're in, which we are in a mess at this time of human history. Envisioning the kind of future that you would like to emerge, and then actively working to bring that about. This is active hope. This is where you choose to use your power of choice to envision a positive future where humanity doesn't destroy itself and its environment and doesn't become extinct, but manages to survive and then manages to find a whole new way of living, which is much more healthy psychologically, spiritually, and interpersonally and economically than the kind of world that's going on now. And that way of living is sustainable, and it ushers in a whole new era of human civilization. And then humanity flowers as never before. And those clenched lotus blossoms hidden in the dirty water under the pool, more and more and more of them break free into the light, and human beings emerge into their full potential and begin the process of what we in the Buddhist tradition would call enlightenment, emerging into the compassionate wisdom and creativity that is potential for all human beings. This is the kind of vision of the future of the human race that I have chosen to have. I choose this vision. You can choose your vision. We have a power of choice, and we can choose that. And if that's the kind of world that you would like to see, then you can set about acting in such a way that makes it more likely to arise. So the kind of future that you imagine has a big effect on your life. So if you imagine a future in which human beings wipe themselves out, along with most other species, and planet Earth becomes a kind of grey desert, a mixture of sand and nuclear fallout, and that's the end of human history. If that's really what you set your mind on, I would say that it's more likely to arise. Because by setting your mind on that, you disempower yourself. And you fall into despair and horror and negative thinking and cynicism. And then it's more likely to come about because you have withdrawn your potential from contributing to a better future. Whereas if you choose to have a positive vision of human history and then set about actively working to bring that about, that future is more likely to arise. You see what I mean? The reality is that the future is wide open, but depending on the way we see it and the way we act, different futures come into being. So this is the message of active hope. If you can envision a better future and then actively work to bring it about, then maybe it will come about. Maybe we will really come through this phase of, you know, climate crisis and global pandemics and nuclear threat and pollution and the most terrible injustices and all the rest of it into a much, much better future in maybe a few centuries from now. I don't know how long it'll take. It doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned, as long as it arises. That's what I'm working for. But vision is vital. And I'll leave it there. I can hear you and see now.
Thank you, Smritiratna.
Oh, that's Susan. Susan, thank you, Susan. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Yes, very inspirational.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning active hope. It's so important.